Senior Minister State Edwin Tong.
I thank the two members for the overall support for the bill, and I'd like to just jump straight into addressing the queries which have been raised, all of which have been very valid questions. Mr. D'Souza asked what the definition of business is in the bill. We would draw from the Business Names Registration Act 2014, and I would just like to define it as such. The business would include every form of trade, commerce and profession, and any other activity that is carried on for the purposes of gain, but does not include any office, employment or occupation. So it refers, for example, to companies, partnerships and sole proprietors which sell precious metals, stones, products such as jewelry. Mr. D'Souza also asked whether the definition of regulated dealing covers purchases of precious stones, metals and products for multiple purposes, including for the purpose of resale. It is not the intention of the regime to cover individuals who make one-off purchases and subsequently may decide then at some stage to sell their items to a second-hand goods dealer. Whilst such activities may be carried on for the purposes of gain, these are conceivably not matters that fall within the definition of business. But of course, if this happens once too often, and there's a pattern of such activity, then all of that will be taken into account when looked at and considered in the context of the definition as to whether there is an activity that generates gain under the definition. Regulated dealers who sell the items to these individuals, so from the individual perspective, I've addressed Mr. D'Souza's point, but from the perspective of the regulated dealers, as well as those who purchase the second-hand items from these individuals, they would have to perform the AML CFT measures where appropriate. On intermediaries, Mr. D'Souza asked what situations specific to Limb B of the definition of regulated dealing involving intermediaries do we envisage we would cover. Intermediaries as defined in Clause 2 of the bill, such as a precious stone metals exchange or auctioneer, would be covered under the bill. And we need to cover the intermediaries because otherwise the intermediaries would immediately provide a way in which you would enable anonymity in the transactions if one uses the intermediary to deal with the transactions in these precious metals. Such intermediaries may import the items from overseas suppliers and perform the sale in Singapore on behalf of their overseas suppliers. Depending on the mode of transaction through the intermediary, it may not be possible for suppliers to perform the AML CFT measures required, for example, to verify the identity of the customer, for example. It is therefore necessary to also regulate intermediaries to ensure that the appropriate AML and CFT measures are performed where necessary. Mr. D'Souza asked if the bill applies to persons or businesses based overseas but engage in dealing with regulated dealers in Singapore. As stated in Clause 14 of the bill, the requirements of Part 3, which deal with this aspect of Mr. D'Souza's concern, apply to all regulated dealers who carry on any part of their business of regulated dealing in Singapore. So the touchstone is that if the business is carried on in Singapore, it would apply to them. In Mr. D'Souza's example, for example, that was cited, the manufacturers based overseas would not have to register with the ministry or comply with the requirements of the regime when purchasing scrap metal from Singapore, as long as he does not carry out any part of that business in Singapore. Nevertheless, such dealers will be subject, of course, to the relevant AML and CFT verifications and processes in their home jurisdictions. Mr. D'Souza asked how the ministry will determine if a product is a precious product, and there's a lot of subjectivity into that. But as Mr. D'Souza also, and I think Mr. Murali also mentioned, there needs to be a degree of flexibility in the way we look at this. Obviously, if one is too prescriptive with the definition, then the effects of the bill will lose its flexibility, and that may then allow a loophole to be introduced. Having said that, we recognize that precious products may have different parameters to determine their value beyond just the value of the stones and metals. For example, in the branding or craftsmanship of such products. In cases where classification of precious products is not immediately apparent, we will of course work with the industry to determine if they ought to be considered as precious products and then provide the necessary guidance to the rest of the industry. And on that score, I recognize both Mr. Murali and Mr. D'Souza raising the point that we need to have more communication between the regulator and the regulated, and that obviously will be done as we embark on this journey if the bill is passed. On multiple transactions, Mr. Murali asked how the ministry would handle customers who spread the transactions over time, flying under the radar and keeping their transactions below the 20,000 threshold. As Mr. Murali knows, under Clause 15, the regulated dealers are required to perform CDD measures on a customer if there are 2 or more transactions in a single day which exceed the threshold of 20,000. There is an existing requirement under the CDSA and also the Serious Crimes Act. It is possible, of course, for customers to transact with multiple, not just one, but multiple different regulated dealers and go below the threshold each time to avoid the CDD checks. However, the threshold itself is designed to make it difficult for criminals to misuse regulated dealers for illicit purposes by introducing a degree of friction in the system, in the way in which the transactions will be done. Should dealers come across any suspicious transactions, they also have the STRO reporting in accordance with the already prevailing existing requirements. We will not expect regulated dealers to share their customers' information with their competitors, obviously, but as the member, Mr. Murali, pointed out, that may not be practical. But he's raised an interesting suggestion about how some of the information could be pooled within or amongst the affiliated dealers or outlets of the same PSMDs, and that might be a better way to try to link the different transactions should such an occurrence of multiple transactions occur. On the record-keeping requirement, both Mr. Pillay and Mr. D'Souza asked about the prescribed period. Mr. Murali is right. We do intend to prescribe in the subsidiary legislation for dealers to keep records for a period of 5 years. This is similar to the record-keeping requirement imposed by all other sectors, including pawnbrokers, and is also aligned with the international standards set by the Financial Action Task Force. Mr. Murali asked about the rationale behind the power to prescribe different time periods for different classes of dealers or transactions. This is needed because the level of ML or TF risk posed by different classes of dealers or transactions may itself require different time periods for the records to be kept. At this point in time, we do not intend to prescribe different time periods, but would like to have the power to do so and make the adjustments at a later stage if we assess that there's a need to impose more stringent record-keeping requirements on certain prescribed classes of dealers or transactions. I just want to touch on how we intend to support the industry, because that's obviously a very relevant question that both members have raised. To start off, as I mentioned earlier, we had engaged the stakeholders early on, even before we formulated this bill, to better understand the mechanics of the sector, how it works, what would be issues that they face on the ground, and what's needed to build capacity to comply with the relevant requirements. These stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, include the major jewelers associations, the bullion market associations, and so on. During the public consultation, we also held briefings and dialogues for industry associations to explain and clarify the requirements of the regime. Moving forward, we will continue to work with these industry associations to engage regulated dealers to help them comply. Well, first of all, understand, and then thereafter also comply with the requirements of the regime. And we intend to do it through regular AML and CFT seminars, outreach sessions, dialogues for the dealers, and the first session will likely be held when registration commences. Secondly, the production and circulation of AML and CFT guidance materials. These will include details on how to perform a proper customer due diligence, how to perform risk assessments, implement internal policies, procedures and controls, and based on feedback from associations, we will also, where appropriate, provide the materials in different languages and issue templates and checklists so as to help the ground and the smaller players within the sector to better appreciate and also implement these measures. So, for instance, we will issue a brochure which will contain information on the registration process to regulated dealers before registration commences. We agree with Mr. D'Souza that the ML and TF risks faced by the subsectors within the industry may differ, so there's not necessarily parity within the different subsectors. And we will work with these subsectors and industry associations to support them and also develop guidelines which may be specific to their needs. Mr. D'Souza asked if regulated dealers will be given the power to ask for private information. In general, regulated dealers are not prohibited from collecting, using, or disclosing personal data, as long as it is strictly required for compliance with the requirements in this bill. However, that said, regulated dealers are required to ensure that reasonable security arrangements are in place to protect personal data in their possession or under their control. That's really no different from the current regime anyway. Other than complying with the requirements in the bill, regulated dealers also have to comply with the Personal Data Protection Act and ensure that personal information obtained is not used or disclosed for other purposes, such as marketing, without the consent of the customer. Where appropriate, we will also be issuing guidance on how personal information should be obtained, handled, and stored. Mr. D'Souza asked what will be done to raise awareness amongst the general public about the new requirements of the regime and the importance of such processes. Those are very good points, and we will work with the industry to inform the public of the importance and the requirements of the regime, in particular the need to obtain customers' personal information as part of that due diligence exercise, so as to facilitate regulated dealers in the compliance with the regime. For example, we may also consider issuing posters and other guidance notes on the new requirements for regulated dealers to put up at their place of businesses. Mr. Speaker, sir, money laundering and terrorism financing are serious offences. They pose significant social, security and reputational concerns. To address these concerns, Singapore has implemented a strong AML and CFT framework for the financial and non-financial sectors. In line with the broader AML CFT framework, this bill will strengthen AML and CFT standards in the PSMT sector through supervision and regulation. It will help to manage money laundering and terrorism financing risk within the sector, which, as members pointed out, is something that has been missing. That's one further piece in the various steps that we take. This would be crucial to combat crime and also improve security both domestically and globally. Finally, it also reaffirms our commitment to be a responsible member of the international community. So with that, with the support of the House, I beg to move.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
The Precious Stones and Precious Metals Prevention of Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing Bill.
Committee stage, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that the Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 42 stand part of the bill. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The schedule. The question is that the schedule stands part of the bill. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Minister for Law.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in Parliament and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
The Precious Stones and Precious Metals Prevention of Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing Bill.